We are burnt out. Many people have discussed why this might be, but today I want to discuss what we can do about it. Any full solution to burnout is going to be economic and social as well as philosophical, but I want to explore some of these important philosophical foundations to burnout and just a few things that might be able to help with it. But first, let's just recap some of the key causes of burnout so we can get a clear view of the territory. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The Burnout Society. In my video on philosopher Byung-Chul Han's best-selling work, The Burnout Society, we discussed his philosophical analysis of burnout. And Han identified the problem not so much as the specific work that we're doing, but rather our relationship to that work, which he thinks encourages us to devote more and more of our time and energy to working, as well as investing our sense of self in our work to an inappropriate degree. This is a pretty good starting point for our thinking, because on the face of it, that some people are burnt out is entirely unsurprising and probably has a straightforward material cause. If someone is working down a mine for 12 hours per day or is overloaded with stress and struggling to make ends meet, then I think the cause of their burnout is pretty evident. Financial difficulties are incredibly stressful, as is being forced to work for long hours in precarious circumstances. I don't think that anyone is mystified by the burnt-out single parent working 3 jobs to ensure that their child can eat. That person doesn't necessarily need philosophy, they need material help. The part of burnout that requires explaining, then, is when someone who is not living paycheck to paycheck and, by global standards, has a rather comfortable life and job, still finds themselves habitually burning out. And for Han, this is caused by a certain societal attitude that we have adopted towards work that then becomes internalized and thus self-enforced. I won't go into too much detail here, as I do have a more in-depth video on Han's views already, but essentially, Han thinks that whereas in the past we were kept working by largely external incentives, things like a violent overseer or a lord in the case of the feudal period, now there is a new, subtler, and slightly more insidious way in which we are motivated to work. And this is a set of values which tells us that we are worthless unless we are working, and judges us largely or solely based on our work. You might be able to see some coherence between Han's views here and the notion of a Protestant work ethic. We have all encountered this value system before. It is basically impossible to ignore. The first thing that almost any sensible adult asks at a social event is, "So what do you do?" effectively signaling that someone's job is the most important thing that you want to know about them. Rather unkindly, many people call those who are struggling with work losers or useless. So much of our modern status games are built around what someone does for a living and how valuable that work is perceived to be. Despite the fact that our cities would entirely fall apart if we did not have skilled bin collectors and sanitation engineers, many people continue to denigrate those jobs. On the other hand, an investment banker might get an awful lot of social status from their work because that work is societally viewed as a great personal achievement. They are seen to have done well in the sphere of work and so are treated with social respect, and sometimes even a vague veneration. The point here is the connection between perceived value, including self-perceived value, and someone's economic achievement. However, Han goes beyond even this. It is one thing for there to be immense social pressure to excel at work, but it's another thing for that pressure to be fully internalized. Put it this way, if there is a social value that you personally have not bought into, or that you vehemently disagree with, then you can at the very least rebel against it. You can try your best to refuse to participate, or even start small communities that put forward alternative sets of values. But if that value has been fed to you and internalized, then it's not just society's value system, it is now your value system too, and you can't get away from it, often no matter how much thinking you do and no matter how hard you try. It is the modern variant of the problem that Socrates identified with restless travelers. He spoke about those who went traveling all around Greece, but remained unhappy everywhere they went because they were still dissatisfied with themselves. Han argues that since we have swallowed this work-based ethic whole, even our attempts to fight against it often fall short. I am often struck by the tone of content online that does let people know just how important rest and time off are, but they tend to say that they're important because if you're too tired, then you just won't be able to work as effectively. There is still the implicit assumption that rest itself is only desirable inasmuch as it allows you to work more and work better. For Hahn, our current ethic is an ethic of performance and achievement, and it is no surprise that this burns us out over time. Hahn calls this attitude auto-exploitation, because even when we're not in an economically precarious or explicitly exploitative situation, we are still treating ourselves as a resource to be mined, as opposed to an autonomous subject who has value in and of themselves. Additionally, this emphasis on work and achievement begins to crowd out other values. Hahn suggests that the veneration of work is part of why our societies have become increasingly atomized. If our societal value is found in working harder than other people, or earning more than them, or working in a high-status industry, in some sense being better than others in the field of work, then we are, by necessity, pitting ourselves against one another, and this has an individualizing impact. A certain amount of human competition may be inevitable, but Hahn thinks our current value system puts us in a permanent mimetic race of keeping up with the Joneses that is sure to exhaust us. It leads to what he calls an overheated ego and a lessening of the other. All of this means that we have internalized this nagging voice that tells us we should always be working, even when we don't strictly need to, or we're attending to other incredibly important parts of our lives, like friends or family or community. Rather than working to live, Hahn thinks we are living to work, and to say no to work feels like some kind of moral failing. It feels like laziness or an undesirable lack of ambition, even when you know that you're taking time off because that is what's best for you and your loved ones. And even as someone who unashamedly loves their job, I am possibly the luckiest person in the world, I still feel this endless, quite intense compulsion to work. And since I obviously don't have contracted hours, it is something I have to keep an eye on. Otherwise, work will just absolutely take over every facet of my life. But I think this is so much worse for those who have this same nagging internal voice, but they hate what they do or find it degrading or are just not getting properly rewarded for their effort. Hahn identifies this as the ultimate cause of burnout. This value system, according to him, reduces each of us to a simple homo economicus whose primary goal in life is to achieve more, lest they be considered totally unworthy. At some level, this is probably an example of Goodhart's law, that when a measurement becomes a target, things tend to go awry. For Hahn, at some point, we stopped treating work as a means and ourselves as the end, and began to treat ourselves as simply another tool to get more work done. If this internal voice is strong enough, then in effect, we'd never have any proper time off or true rest. Just like Socrates' traveller, we are stuck with the part of ourselves that nags at us to work or to be productive. And so even in situations that we should consider entirely ours to do with as we please, we feel guilty. This guilt only reinforces the vicious cycle, and soon we find ourselves back at our desks, not feeling any better for the rest, and wondering why we can't just switch off from time to time. For Hahn, we have become our own overseers, even when no one is watching. But that is just establishing one of the many, many causes behind burnout. As I said, there are also clearly social, political, and economic factors at play. But this is a philosophy channel, so I want to tackle the philosophical aspect. And if Hahn is right, this will probably involve creating new value systems that re-enchant and re-dignify the areas of our lives that have nothing to do with work. So let's start by rediscovering one aspect of our philosophical history that may already have some of the answers. If you want to support the channel and you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my absolutely wonderful backers on Patreon to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion, book-by-book bookshelf tour. You can also subscribe to my Substack for occasional shorter articles. The links are in the description. 2. Leisure and dignity. There are few subjects in philosophy that Aristotle did not contribute to. He was a founder of ancient logic, one of the first major scientists, and even had a theory of human psychology that is surprisingly up to date with some modern empirical findings. He also had a conception of leisure which was highly interesting, and is very often caricatured. The famous quotation often used to sum up Aristotle's theory of leisure is the following: "For we do business in order that we may have leisure, and carry on war in order that we may have peace." This makes clear Aristotle's order of priorities. For him, work is a means to leisure and not the other way round. However, by leisure, Aristotle meant something slightly more substantial than just time spent not working. As pointed out by Joseph Owens, Aristotle separates leisure from both work on the one hand, but also entertainment or merely fun on the other. He thinks that both of those are necessary for a good life, but he also thinks that what they're in service to is leisure. And what is leisure? For Aristotle, it is time spent aiming for the highest good. In itself, this is just not that helpful of a definition for our purposes. For Aristotle, the highest good is something like philosophical contemplation, but there is a sense in which that might have something to do with him being a philosopher and thus loving philosophy. But at the same time, if we expand this concept slightly in order to recognize that there might be some plausible variation in what people could consider the highest good, then we might get a bit more purchase on how to use this concept of Aristotelian leisure today. As Joseph Owens also points out, Aristotle has a number of quite hands-on theories as to how we can set up our lives to attain this highest good. In the Nicomachean Ethics, which might be the most useful philosophy book ever written, Aristotle talks about a number of uses for leisure time which he thought would contribute to long-term fulfillment. These included activities like learning and habituating virtuous properties, but a full 2 books of the Nicomachean Ethics are devoted to making and sustaining the right kind of friendships, which Aristotle thought were indispensable to long-term fulfillment and virtue, and thus to leisure. Either way, the general structure is instructive. And regardless of what you think of the specifics of Aristotle's philosophy, this framing he has for leisure, where it's used to acquire eudaimonic fulfillment and aim at the highest good, both gives us a fair guide on how we might want to use our own leisure time, and more importantly, lends a sort of resonant dignity to leisure as a concept. It makes it seem like something that is worth aiming at, almost in and of itself. The narratives we are fed about leisure today are pretty negative on the whole. If Hahn is right, and to work is seen as a sign of moral worth, then leisure is probably seen as morally unideal, in that it takes away from potential work time, which is conceived of as more valuable. And as a result, we have a picture of leisure that I would call unreasonably uncharitable and unkind. I don't know how well known this is as a reference, but in the early 2000s, there was this whole swath of British television programs whose entire shtick was to look down on people who were unemployed or otherwise on some kind of social welfare and who were often struggling. Programs like this also had the side effect of painting time off itself as something rather lazy or undesirable. Of course, this is not an isolated incident, and there are so many more examples of this kind of thing across many different cultures. I just wanted to pick this one because I'm familiar with it, and it was particularly egregious. Anyone who's seen these programs can attest to that. If Aristotle pictured leisure as a noble pursuit, setting up your life in a virtuous and fulfilling manner, then our image of leisure today is of someone collapsed on the sofa, half asleep, drooling and staring at their phone. But this is not all that leisure could be, and nor is it how most people would actually want to use their leisure time. It just contributes to this general idea that not working or time off or any time spent in leisure is in some sense immoral. The thing is, if our culturally dominant conception of leisure is of this type of activity, which most people find totally unfulfilling anyway, then it's much harder not to buy into the notion that work is the only worthwhile thing to do, or one of the only worthwhile things to do. It is as if the only exposure you had to films or books were the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy. You would be forgiven for thinking that literature and film were a complete waste of time or only fit for frivolity to be set aside for serious matters. But if Aristotle is to be believed, then leisure is anything but trivial. It is the time in our life where we are truly free, and how we use this leisure time is among the most important decisions of our life. To stand a chance at defeating burnout, we first need to reconceptualize leisure as at least as valuable as work, if not more so, if not the thing that work is buying us. And to do that, we need to have an idea of it that is at least as compelling or seductive as the constant narrative we've been fed that extols the virtue of endless work, bearing in mind that this narrative has had the advantage of both time and general cultural entrenchment. The reason I wanted to bring up Aristotle here is because he demonstrates that in a different time period to our own, leisure was not looked down upon in the way that it often is today, and also that leisure is not some concern of ivory tower academics, but was conceived of as a fundamental part of every single person's life. I fear that a lot of our demonization of leisure comes from considering it an ephemeral part of existence or something only fit for children. This attitude would have struck Aristotle as absurd. Now, this is not to say that we ought to denigrate work. I just think we can hold both things as valuable. At this point, it's very easy to think that our work is done, no pun intended, and also to perceive our answer as pretty trivial. The problem was that leisure had been devalued, so our solution is to value leisure. Great, I wish I'd thought of that sooner. But, as anyone who has actually tried to enact a genuine change in their value system will have discovered, it's just not that simple. Just because we find something cognitively sensible does not mean that it will translate into our sense of existential or emotional fulfillment, nor will it undo years of being told that work is among the only things worth doing and one of the only carriers of human dignity or worth. So, I want to borrow another very interesting observation by Hahn, which is that much of meaning creation is about narrative. By this, he doesn't straightforwardly mean stories, but rather any kind of structure that can capture both our emotions and our intellect. This will make more sense with an example, and this one actually is a story. When I was a child, I absolutely loved the Lord of the Rings films. I'm sure this comes as an immense shock to you all. Specifically, I loved the character of Gandalf. I loved how he seemed to know things, and that knowledge came in handy for his friends and companions. Watching those films and internalizing those narratives made the pursuit of learning slightly romantic and thus made it seem inherently meaningful. I'm sure I'm not the only one who does this. There are thousands of playlists on YouTube entitled things like Gregorian Chants to Study Like a Priest Uncovering the Mind of God to, and incidentally, I've listened to all of them. I know this is a tongue-in-cheek example, but it illustrates a very important point. When ideas are embedded in compelling narratives and stories, they have more opportunity to stick, and more importantly, stick at this deeper emotional level. This isn't just anecdotal. Some psychologists have proposed that learning from fiction is partly because we can run an internal simulation of what's happening in the story, which then helps make the narrative come to life and change the way we see the world as if we ourselves had gone through that very experience. It's not the same as going through that experience, of course, but it is an echo of what that might be. As Broom et al. Put it, summarizing a lot of prior research shows that the greater one's identification with a character, the more likely it is that one's self-beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors will change to become more similar to those of the character. Moreover, there is evidence that identification with characters continues to influence people after the narrative experience is over by increasing cognitive elaboration on the story and its characters, thereby contributing to greater attitude change in the spectator. In which case, here is one quite promising plank in our solution to burnout. It will involve creating new, dominant cultural narratives, whereby somebody can be considered a fully successful and admirable person, with that success conceived of in terms of things other than work. This is a huge undertaking, and, as we'll see, it is certainly not something that we can do alone. But, in our own rather small ways, hopefully we can start to forge these narratives. There is plenty to work from. If pressed, most of us know that we find many other things like family or friends or kindness deeply fulfilling, but we need to incorporate them into our broader societal narratives as to what makes a good or successful or admirable or worthy person. However, this is clearly no mean feat, and it's far easier said than done. I think by rediscovering already incredibly highly respected and venerated thinkers like Aristotle, and noticing just how many of them prized leisure as among the most important parts of life, we can begin to eschew our prejudice against leisure and see its value with slightly clearer eyes. But next, we have touched upon the concept of friendship a number of times in this section, and I really think that it deserves a closer look. 3. You've got a friend in me. My mild hot take about the male loneliness epidemic discourse from all the way back in last year was that we were just looking at the whole situation completely backwards. It was almost always viewed simply through the lens of sexual relationships or romance. But, as is so often the case, the incredible benefits of friendship and community more widely tended to go unacknowledged. Our time spent with our friends is continually rated as among the best times we have in our life, often over and above the time spent with a romantic partner. A sense of community has been reliably linked to lowered stress and lowered risk of anxiety and depression, as well as helping the effects of burnout on an individual level. And this only makes sense, considering that one of the main drives behind burnout for Han is how it divides us against one another, and so leads to increasingly atomized societies. When we're just all by ourselves, it is so much easier to fall into the trap of only valuing individual achievement because that's all we really have access to. It is so much harder to take pride in what we do for other people or our relationships when we either don't have any or they are incredibly weak and ephemeral. It's telling that Aristotle wrote 2 whole books of his most important ethical treatise aimed at discovering the good life entirely on friendship. In his other works, like The Death of Ritual and The Crisis of Narration, Han argues that many of the scaffolds upon which we hang our general sense of community have been eroded by some of the same tools and drives that led to the Burnout Society. Much of Han's point is that community and friendship are often much stranger and less rational than we tend to consider, and that the erosion of these bizarre components is part of what's contributing to our crisis of friendship. This comes out most clearly in his discussion around ritual. From the outside, rituals often look incredibly bizarre, but Han argues that we must have a clear view of the importance of ritual in order to forge communities. Rituals can imbue time with a sense of meaningful structure, and they bring together the community in a single shared action, at least for a moment. Consider a religious service. One of the things that this does for religious communities is allocate one morning a week where they all gather in a single place in order to affirm a shared set of values and thus strengthen the bonds which bind them together as one in-group. Of course, this doesn't always work perfectly, and Han would be the first person to point out that the total submission of the individual to a collective would also be pretty undesirable. But there is a middle ground to be found here in the tension between us asserting our independence from a group and still not becoming totally isolated from that group. I would also say that I think that the bizarreness of rituals are often a feature, not a bug, since the only reason you would take part in something that, on its face, seems irrational is simply because you want to partake in the group dynamic, and this further strengthens the community. At one level, this community building is a very practical solution to burnout, in that if you do have close friends or a tight-knit community, then you're basically forced to spend time doing things other than working, and you'll hopefully become immersed in that social setting for that time. This is a deeply ground-level and hands-on benefit of friendship, and one that works directly counter to the pressures of always being productive or always achieving more that's brought on by this burnout society. But at another level, friendship gives us an avenue for affirming one another's value that is not tied to our personal achievements or what we're doing for money. I'll give you a quick example from my own life. This channel, like any YouTube channel, has good months and bad months and can perform wildly differently week to week and certainly day to day. For a while, I also ran it from a shoebox one-bed flat in a place where I barely knew anyone. As a result, my sense of self-worth was unreasonably tied to how well the channel was doing at that particular moment in time, since I just didn't have that much else to reach for regarding building meaning in my life. And this was an absolute recipe for stress and eventually burnout. After reading Han, I actually decided to move to a place closer to friends and family, and I made a conscious effort to build up a sense of community here. As a result, I spend a significant proportion of my free time around people who honestly just couldn't give a toss about how well the channel is doing, and just either want a good laugh or want to spend time enjoying one another's company. Effectively, this is time spent where we each let one another know that regardless of how well they're doing concerning employment or achievement, we value them all the same. My uncle and grandfather both worked in wholesale food delivery and spent a significant proportion of their life working 6 days a week from 3 a.m. to 7 p.m. When I asked them how they managed this frankly absurd workload without completely burning out, they each cited their strong circle of friends. There just seems to be something about human connection that runs directly counter to burnout, and I suspect that it's partly to do with this alternative set of values that's essentially embodied within friendships. It helps that we are hardwired as social creatures, and somewhere deep in our evolved mind, for want of a better term, we associate isolation with a risk of death and community with safety. However, I think this is only the start of the immense philosophical potential of friendship and interpersonal connection. Remember in the last section, we spoke about the difficulties of building alternative narratives for life and alternative value systems by ourselves as individuals. I was borrowing an observation from the great philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who recently passed away, who held that values are fundamentally social and historically extended things. It is borderline impossible to just value something in isolation because we take our value cues from the way that people around us behave and evaluate things, as well as the specific cultural traditions in which we've been brought up. At first, this might sound like it would make combating burnout that bit more difficult. After all, if we've grown up in a tradition of valuing mostly individual achievement and especially work, how do we escape that under MacIntyre's framework? But community may hold part of the solution. When we come together to form values as part of a community, we are specifically not acting alone. We are interacting with others, exchanging ideas, and developing our own traditions and practices along the way. Again, this can sound abstract, but it is eminently applicable. Think about how your family might have particular traditions or value particular things in a way that is subtly separate from the dominant values of your wider society, and how that has almost certainly fundamentally impacted your view of the world. My point, although for the record I'm not really sure MacIntyre would agree with me here, is that forging friendships and communities is not just a practical way to stop yourself burning out in the short term, it is the means by which we can learn to create and foster new value systems that can balance the ones of individual achievement and accomplishment. Friendship is both in itself a natural manifestation of underlying values that are not achievement-oriented, and also the means to consciously forge other values that are not achievement-oriented. This actually gives us an enactable set of things that we can actively do to combat burnout. It's all very well saying that we need to craft new values, but this process where we build communities and then encourage valuing slightly different things within those communities is not simply a theoretical exercise, it's something that we can do right now. And if we have a few friends, we are already well on our way to doing it. Although I personally am an atheist, I also have to admit that when it comes to this particular step, religious communities are just well ahead of the rest of us. One of the real benefits to having a transcendent being as the zenith of your communal value system is that this is already a very natural alternative to the values of achievement and performance. If you know that God is happy with you, then honestly, who cares whether other people perceive you as underachieving? You are winning the only game that matters. Arguably, the people who take this notion the furthest are ascetic monastics who eschew individual achievement completely. But, of course, we can't all be monks and nuns, and I think this may be something of an overcorrection. As a bonus, I suspect that this renewed focus on community will not just help with burnout, but with all manner of our socio-psychological issues. It has been shown that we become less polarized when we speak to real people who disagree with us, and we become less scared of the outside world and other people when we continue to encounter it. And most obviously, we also become less lonely and isolated when we do have a community to turn to. I don't want to pull the "we did it in the past, therefore it's good" card, because ultimately I think that's a very poor argument by itself. But it is worth noting that the particular devaluing of community that we have at the moment is really quite peculiar to our age and general location. And we will have to make a conscious effort if we want to recoup just some of this togetherness. But, we can also have penicillin this time around as well. But finally, I want to have a look at maybe a slightly unintuitive way to combat burnout, but one that I've become increasingly interested in over time. 4. Creation, expression, and you. A lot of this section is inspired by a video by the fantastic YouTuber Sisyphus55 called "The Cure to Burnout is Art," and I would highly encourage you to check that out. Here, he puts forward a thesis that part of the drive behind burnout is because our lives become very samey. We get up, we do roughly the same kind of work, and then we go to bed again, and then do the same thing the next morning, ad infinitum. This reminds me of something that Hahn talks about also with regards to the Burnout Society, which he calls the inferno of the same. Hahn means many, many things by this, but part of it is that when achievement value has become the only kind of thing you're striving after, then it turns life into a sort of perpetual grind. For Hahn, part of the problem in simply focusing on work and achievement is that it creates a rather one-dimensional life and a rather one-dimensional value system. Part of Sisyphus55's solution is to treat your life a little bit like a work of art, actively exploring variations on the structure of your life and indulging in a bit more of a playful attitude towards your personal philosophy. In short, livening things up through variation, and also through active, thoughtful participation in the shape of your own existence. Personally, I might even go one step further and argue that the act of creation itself can help alleviate some of our burnout-inducing value system. One of the most unfortunate aspects of our public perception of art and creativity is that they are obscure, elitist, and considered the sole purview of experts who've trained years to produce their artistic masterpieces. However, I think this is yet another example of our achievement-oriented values creeping in. The underlying assumption at play is that it's only worth making art if you're doing something new or something that will blow a viewer, a reader, or an audience away. It views art as necessarily striving towards achievement. But this ignores a whole nother domain of art that Aldous Huxley once called art as therapy. This is art that Huxley states is just not done with the aim of gathering a crowd or even for anyone to observe it. Rather, it is art created for the sake of the artist and the joy of creation, so that they can exercise their drives towards creativity. As an author, Huxley was acutely aware of the kind of fulfillment that a creative pursuit can bring, and his hope for increasing technological progress was that we could open up far more time for people to become this kind of private, expressive artist. Bertrand Russell articulated a similar yet subtly different idea in Praise of Idleness. We have not seen the kind of extreme gains in leisure time that these thinkers predicted, but we can still take on board their shared intuition that what many people really want to do, what they really find fulfilling, is some form of creation. And moreover, people enjoy creating as a form of private self-expression. Again, I think people often chronically underestimate just how creative they are. Creativity is not just found in Michelangelo's David or some great work of poetry. I would argue that a huge number of hobbies contain large measures of creativity and expression. A friend of mine once waxed lyrical about just how fulfilling he felt building his garden shed, even though he was basically just following instructions. We don't tend to call these things art, But I think that has more to do with a cultural perception of art as far off and for a select elite few, rather than any intrinsic type differences between these activities. And again, we find that creative expression attacks burnout from a number of different angles. Firstly, it simply is time that we spend actively away from work in a fulfilling pursuit. One of the more unfortunate pressures of recent years, in my view, is that we are increasingly encouraged to turn everything we do and everything we love into a side hustle. If we keep our creative expression as firmly done for its own sake and for the joy of it, then it is time we spend immersed in an activity that has nothing to do with work or economic gain, and so recognizes values beyond this. Additionally, much like in the case of friendship, in the decision to partake in a creative activity that does have no economic benefit, we enact the value that there are things that are worth participating in that are not work. A huge theme in the school of existentialism that stems from Jean-Paul Sartre is that our values are created when we act in the world. If he is right, then each time we choose to spend an hour or so in creative expression, we are slowly balancing the scales of the value of work and the value of leisure in our minds. By choosing to create and feeling the sense of fulfillment that comes with this, we also get straightforward evidence that creative pursuits bring enormous amounts of pleasure and are thus worthy of our time and attention, regardless of what anyone else says. Thirdly, in creativity itself, we may become more able to shape our own values. This is a point famously made by Friedrich Nietzsche in his argument connecting artistic creation to autonomy and self-described meaning. Essentially, Nietzsche thought that the same kinds of faculty that allowed us to create great art would also allow us to craft new values in a godless world. Nietzsche's thoughts here are obviously and always very complex, but one way of looking at it, which is heavily oversimplified, is this. In creation, we get very used to making meaning out of nothing, and this same attitude can be used to, in Nietzsche's words, give style to our lives. In classic Nietzsche fashion here, there is loads of room for ambiguity, but I do suspect that this general line of thinking may be onto something. Let me know if it chimes with your intuitions or your past experience. And this connection between creativity and a response to burnout is, in my opinion, deeply underexplored. And if we begin to put all of the strategies that we've looked at in this video together, we find that they form a reasonably coherent whole, which may place us on the right track to constructing some values to balance those that lead to burnout. First, we know what rough changes to our value system we desire. Mainly, we want a value system where at least as much emphasis is placed on leisure as on work, and how we use that leisure is seen as just as, if not even more important, than what we do for a living. We want to end up in the kind of situation where the question, how do you spend your free time, or what are you passionate about, is just as important as the question, so what do you do? This, in itself, will take an awful lot of work, which is luckily where our second step comes in. We want to create communities that are bonded by something other than work. We have a huge variety to pick from here. We can have those based around hobbies or around religions or faiths. These little enclaves naturally allow alternative values to emerge. I don't know if you've ever been to something like a chess club, but your main status symbol there is how good at chess you are. For the record, I'm absolutely terrible, so I am always the equivalent of a hapless serf. It is so much easier to find alternative values in these mini groups, and as a bonus, it combats the increasing atomization and isolation of our societies. Thirdly, through a type of creative self-expression, whatever particular form that may take, we can begin to rediscover parts of our life that are both intrinsically fulfilling and have nothing to do with work. This puts all our abstract theorizing into practice. We're not just saying, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we valued non-work related forms of action and expression? We are actively enacting those values, and hopefully, this will begin to shift our underlying commitments away from simply achievement and performance and towards a more well-rounded value system. If thinkers like Nietzsche are right, this would also translate to an ability to become more creative in the shaping of our own lives as well, though personally I remain a little bit agnostic about the connection here. Of course, as I said in the beginning of the video, tackling burnout is a hugely multifaceted problem, and philosophy is only one small part of it. But if we do take some pointers from these philosophers, my hope is that we can begin to re-enchant and re-romanticize those aspects of our lives that have nothing to do with work and nothing to do with achievement. One day, we may even return to a slightly more Aristotelian way of viewing things and see work, entertainment, and leisure all as key parts of a fulfilling human life. Though, as we've seen, this is far easier said than done, and it takes consistent effort to move a value system. But if you do want to check out the prequel to this video, which looks at the phenomenon of burnout itself and what causes it in much more detail, then you can check out my video on Han's work right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.